Today's lesson is an introduction to Europe's Age of Enlightenment. Today's thesis is on the screen. As with the scientific revolution, Europe's Age of Enlightenment, which occurred primarily in the 1700s, was a time of significant cultural change. These cultural changes, which dealt mostly with intellectual discoveries, would lead to significant political changes not just in Europe, but around the world. By the late 17th century, the late 1600s, the discoveries of the scientific revolution had inspired other philosophers to begin observations and analyses of the human world, of human systems such as governments, culture, and social structures. The philosophers of this period, known as the Age of Enlightenment or the Age of Reason, would critique traditional beliefs about a wide variety of topics, including human nature, politics, and religion. By the 18th century, the heyday of the Enlightenment, essays and articles about Enlightenment ideas appeared in magazines and newspapers, which were published on regular cycles with subscriptions available for each. Pamphlets, short texts which could be printed on 1 or 2 sheets, were also a popular and cheap way to publish ideas. In this way, the Enlightenment was a literary movement. The Enlightenment was also a public movement, in the sense that people gathered to discuss their ideas. New businesses featuring the sale of coffee opened across Western Europe at this time. These businesses showcased the intensification of global commerce because they demonstrated how popular coffee, which was cultivated primarily in South America and parts of Africa, had become in Europe. They were also gathering places where men could go and meet up with similar-minded people to discuss the news and articles they'd read in newspapers or in magazines. The Enlightenment also allowed women to participate more directly in these discussions, primarily through the salon. The salon was a meeting, usually held in the drawing room or salon of a house, during which philosophers were invited to come and share or debate their ideas, while others listened to the discussion or to the reading of these new ideas. Salons were often hosted by knowledgeable women who served as patrons to some philosophers and who were sometimes themselves philosophers. In fact, in the Enlightenment, we have for the first time documented participation of a wide variety of women who were interested in this challenge of the status quo. The first Enlightenment philosophers often criticized traditional political ideas. As we've learned, the political philosophy of absolutism had become the primary organizing idea of government around the world by the end of the 17th century. Absolutist monarchies existed throughout Afro-Eurasia, including in Europe. In the mid-17th century, England had fought a civil war to remove an absolutist monarch. By the late 1680s, the English had established a constitutional monarchy in which an elected parliament held legislative power. In 1690, Englishman John Locke published his second treatise of government, which supported the new government in England. After 1689, England's parliament limited the monarch's power. Members of parliament were elected. This meant they, at least theoretically, represented the people. The fact that the people had such political power is called popular sovereignty. In his text, Locke claimed that rulers had authority only by social contract. This social contract is the idea that a ruler has authority only because the people he rules have given their authority to him temporarily. According to Locke, if at any time that ruler becomes a tyrant, his subjects can take back their authority and they can select a better ruler because they have popular sovereignty. Locke's ideas of government influenced French philosophers who were themselves criticizing their absolutist monarchy. In France, King Louis XIV had established an absolutist state in the 17th century, and he had ruled for a ridiculously long time, from 1643 until 1715. The changes he made to the government had made it very difficult for his subjects to have a voice in that government, and by the mid-18th century, some of those subjects were advocating for change. The Baron de Montesquieu published The Spirit of the Laws in the 1740s. The thesis of his text was that the best kind of government was a balanced one in which the government had multiple branches, and each branch served as a check on the other branches. It was Montesquieu who introduced the concept of checks and balances in government. He hoped to inspire the development of a constitutional monarchy in France that somewhat mirrored the one in England. Just over a decade later, another French philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, published The Social Contract. In this text, Rousseau adopted Locke's idea of a social contract and further argued that a state didn't necessarily need one ruler, one monarch, to function. Rousseau posited that an elected government that ruled by the general will, by the desire of the majority, could be effective. Rousseau also believed that, in order to have a fully functioning government, the citizenry needed to be educated. He outlined an entire course of education for young men, but, like many of his time, Rousseau didn't believe that women had a place in government or that women should be educated in a similar way to men. In other words, the equality Rousseau championed left out half of the population. Enlightenment philosophers didn't just critique the political systems themselves, they also critiqued the rights granted, or not granted, to people living within those political systems. One of the biggest topics of discussion was the growing movement to abolish slavery. Abolitionism, as this movement is called, was particularly powerful in Great Britain, where politicians like William Wilberforce was initially just against the continuation of the slave trade, which by that point had been in place for nearly 300 years. Later, influenced by his religious beliefs, Wilberforce was a Methodist, a religion begun by John Wesley, who, you may remember, wrote one of the documents you read in our slave trade discussion. And Wilberforce ended up advocating for the immediate abolition of the slave trade and the gradual abolition of slavery. It should be noted that many abolitionists, while wanting to end slavery, were not necessarily anti-racists. Most abolitionists of this period and into the 19th century wanted to end slavery because they thought people of African descent were people and could establish their own functioning societies. At the same time, though, they wanted people of African descent to establish those free societies in Africa. In other words, they were in favor of what we today call segregation. For some philosophers, the arguments about granting African people freedom dovetailed with the reality that not all people in European societies were truly free. In particular, women philosophers often raised the question of women's rights, challenging the traditional patriarchal structure which kept women away from public roles. Probably the most famous of these philosophers was Mary Wollstonecraft, who, in 1792, published A Vindication on the Rights of Women, a text which argued that women were only seen as weak and unfit for public life because they weren't given the opportunity to learn and grow as men were given. She argued for equal educational opportunities and equal opportunities to participate in public life. She believed women could and should serve in government. Like political systems and civil rights, the need for education was another hot Enlightenment topic. At this time, the vast majority of people could not afford a formal education. The wealthy could hire tutors for their children, who were homeschooled. Then, boys were often sent away to a boarding school around age 12 and then went on to university. Girls would often not receive any additional formal education. There were a few day schools which educated children, but most of those were connected to churches. Ideas about education were regularly introduced and debated during the Enlightenment. Some philosophers, like John Locke, introduced ideas about instructional pedagogy, ideas about how children should be taught, and, as we've seen, other philosophers like Mary Wollstonecraft argued for more equal educational opportunities. Denis Diderot was a man who wanted to help bridge the opportunity gap of education. His grand idea was to collect essays and articles about varied topics, all written by experts in their field, which would then be published in a set of volumes. Those without access to a formal education, but who could read and afford a book, could then purchase these volumes and have a sort of curriculum for their education. Diderot called his set the Encyclopedia, and he hoped to publish a volume nearly every year. Many philosophers contributed to these volumes. Diderot even reprinted the works of now dead philosophers such as John Locke. His goal was to create an educated public, one which could, regardless of their family wealth, engage in government and in society. Perhaps inevitably, philosophers also began to challenge prevailing economic theories, which meant challenging mercantilism. Scottish philosopher Adam Smith believed that both producers and consumers acted to fulfill their self-interest, and that the interaction between these two groups of people would result in the invisible hand determining the prices and quantities of goods. Remember our supply and demand graphs from an earlier lesson? Well, Smith believed that governments should protect the free market, that is, letting people produce and exchange goods freely. Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations in 1776. In this text, he argued that the size of the economy, and thus the amount of wealth in the world, was not finite. Rather, he theorized that the wealth of the world could grow as new industries emerged and as competition between businesses was encouraged due to the free market. Smith also believed that states should encourage economic competition, because doing so would encourage both innovation and lower prices. Smith's approach, the capitalist approach, meant that governments didn't need to worry quite so much about getting and maintaining colonies themselves in order to maintain wealth. Rather, governments should encourage a free market, collect taxes, and focus on maintaining order and providing infrastructure for the people who would continue to expand the economy. Obviously, some of these Enlightenment ideas directly attacked the absolutist system that states had developed over the course of the late 16th and 17th centuries. Some rulers tried to suppress these ideas wholesale in the hopes that they just wouldn't spread. But other rulers decided to adopt those Enlightenment ideals they most liked in the hopes that their choosing to reform certain things would suppress other significant revolts. Ruling in this way, by maintaining absolute power through the adoption of some Enlightenment ideas, is called enlightened absolutism. One of the most successful rulers who adopted enlightened absolutism was Catherine the Great, who was the Tsarina of Russia in the late 18th century. Catherine introduced and enforced some of the Enlightenment ideas about education in Russia. In particular, she established schools for the girls of noble families to attend. She also allowed for some Enlightenment texts to be published, but not all text. She retained a right to censor. In this way, by straddling the ideas of the Enlightenment, Catherine and other enlightened absolutists, like her, were able to maintain their absolute power. They enacted those reforms they felt could be enforced without giving up too much of their own authority. Therefore, they remained absolutists while also providing some enlightened benefit to their subjects. The ideas and theories which emerged during the Enlightenment were hugely influential in the last decades of the 18th century and the first decades of the 19th century. As we'll soon see, the most immediate consequence was one of pretty drastic political change.